Right, so what we're going to do today, we're going to start our studies of facial features. We're going to look at how to draw the eye. We're going to look at the structure of the eye, and then we are going to later on, next lesson, look at other facial features like the nose, like the mouth, etc. So first of all today, let's talk about the structure of the eye. First thing is think about the eye in the shape of a rugby ball. Probably a little bit more like an American rugby ball with pointed edges, but here, instead of going round, where the cheek pushes up against the inner section, tends to curve a little bit. In the corner, we have shape of a tear duct. This varies for every person. And then, of course, we have the eyelid, which on some people is more prominent. Some people it includes a couple of folds. And then, of course, in the middle, we've got the iris and the pupil. In this eye in particular, you've got the eye disappears underneath the top eyelid. And the pupil is quite large, and then there's a reflection, quite a large reflection. You can even see details like the eyelashes reflected there. If you look carefully, the eyelashes from this area curve up from under the eyelid, whereas here they curve down in little groups, but they're not on this section. They're actually below the section. Now, before one goes on to the shading part, if one was to draw a different type of eye, if the eye was slightly narrower, it would still be that rugby ball shape, which curved up on the inner edge like that. It might still have clear sections of where you see the eyelid, but it could be the case that the top and the bottom of the eye disappeared if the eye was more closed. Alternatively, if the eye was more open, you might see the bottom and you might see the top. So, what we're going to do today, we're going to split the page very lightly in half. I'll work a bit harder so you can see it on the screen. And we're going to put an eye on one side, and then we're going to draw the eye, and later on we're going to do a nose, and we're going to draw the nose, etc. If it was me, I would do the eye and the mouth landscape on the page because they seem to fit that way. And if I was going to do the mouth, if I was going to do the nose on the next page and the ear, I would do it that way. But anyway, for today, let's concentrate on the eye. If we go back to our drawing stage, we get the shape accurately. I think it's always better if you work on a slightly larger scale. So working quite lightly to get the rugby ball shape. Get this curve which goes in there. I'm going to put my little tear duct in the corner and start to put my eyelid. And again, here, the eye is very circular. Work lightly because you will make a mistake. I'm going to put the pupil in, which actually is incredibly large because it's obviously open very wide and you have a reflection here. You can see the eyelashes reflected here. The more observant of you will probably count them. When it comes to adding tone, a good idea to do is to take a bit of scrap paper, take a slightly darker pencil. I'm taking a 4B, cotton wool bud, and then I can gradually and subtly add my tone to the areas which need a bit of shadow. So the eye is white there, but it's actually lighter on the left hand side, but a bit darker on the right hand side. And again, the central pupil is quite dark, but outside it on the iris is a bit lighter. And then you can use your normal pencil to start to draw in the individual detail. You can see these tiny marks which are important for you to achieve. You don't get any extra marks for doing the eyebrows. We're looking at you concentrating all your time and effort on this.
So now it's a case of working into the drawing, looking very closely at all the fine details and using a combination of your stump or your cotton wool bud and then obviously your pencil. Telescopic pencil is obviously very good for the very fine details, but what is also very important is the quality of picture you work from. So if you get a very high quality picture from Google Images, for example, one you can zoom into, you are more likely to get a higher quality drawing like this one. So if we now go on and look at some examples of student work, this is an example of a developing drawing. You can see there's some level of detail in there and shading, but the basic shape is incorrect. The drawing of the eye and the pupil needs to be far rounder. Next we see an example of a secure drawing. Very good structure and shape to the eye. Good level of detail, but what's missing is that underlying tone, the shading, perhaps put in with cotton wool bud or a stamp before working into the drawing with a fine pencil. And finally we see the excellent example from before, which has got good structure, good level of shading and tone, and obviously a very high level of detail. Next, if we look at some examples of the drawing of the mouth, we see here a developing example. There is some effort to get the shape correct and to add some tone and some detail, but it lacks some of the fine level of detail and careful shading one would expect in a secure example. Next, we see a secure example. We see some nice blending with the pencil, and we see the initial attempts to add fine detail and those creases and little marks on the lips. One way in which these drawings perhaps would be made better is if the students worked a little larger. Finally, if we look at an excellent example, we see very accurately drawn lips, slightly bigger to give the student a bit more space to add that level of detail and careful shading. And if one looks closely, one can see the student has even added little highlights by taking out some of the shading with a rubber where the light catches the lips. This is a very high quality example. Next, if we look at some nose drawings, we see another example of a developing. Again, the student is a bit disadvantaged by working a little bit too small. Good use of adding tone with cotton wool bud, but then the outlines are very boldly put in and there's no gradual, careful shading. If we look at the next example, which would be good enough to achieve a secure, we see very good adding of tone with a stump or a cotton wool bud. It does actually appear very three-dimensional, and the student obviously understands the shape of the nose. The outline of the nostrils, just that line which is drawn, isn't quite like that in the picture. The line needs to be a little bit more careful than that so it doesn't stand out so much, but still very good drawing. If one now looks at the next level up, an example of excellence, one can see the student does the same as the secure example, but he's then worked into the drawing with his pencil to add some additional shading and to create a much more realistic drawing and a much more three-dimensional drawing of the nose. And finally, you can see the student has even added a little bit more tone on that right-hand side of the nose, which helps to make it look more three-dimensional, as shown in the picture. Lastly, if we look at some of the drawings of ears, we see this example developing. What makes it developing is not only the lack of careful shading and blending and detail, but when one looks at it and compares it to the photograph, it's a different side and it's a totally different angle. It's obvious he hasn't copied from that photograph. If we look next at an example which is a secure, but a secure minus, you can see the shape and the structure is correct, but when one looks closely at the quality of shading and blending, there isn't enough there in order to put it into a straightforward secure. The presentation is also a little bit poor because when you look at the drawing compared to the photograph's been cut off so you can't even see the bottom. And finally, if we look at an example which is clearly excellent, you've got, again, the student has got the structure correct. You can see that he's carefully blended in the different tones with cotton wool bud or a stump, and then been willing to work into it carefully with a pencil, which is what a lot of students don't do. They'll work into it with a stump, but then they won't do that extra level of shading and detail with their normal pencil. And this student's even added some hair around the drawing. She didn't need to do, but it does help the drawing itself look even better. So there are your examples of the 4 facial features, and you have a developing, a secure, and an excellent example of each.